so you have this. Now I'm trying to
I like how you highlight, because I didn't think of it as an image of him going up to him with an empty bowl, asking Joshu, the question that he's like, have you eaten your rice porridge?
So rice is the plain old staple. Everyone knows about it. No one necessarily likes it, but it's the food of the gods.
Welcome to Not Zen, where we talk about Zen and whatnot and what's not. Today we're going to be looking at a case from the Mumenkin, case 35. Pardon my pronunciation skills, but it is called Seijo's Soul Separated in this translation I have. I'm joined by others here, some regulars. And to my left, we have Micah. If you would say hi.
What's up? What's going on?
Dan.
Rocking my own soul. This is Dan, King of Soul.
Uke.
Here.
Aaron Macaroni.
Macaroni is present.
And Kevin.
Hi, this is the time for presents.
The Mumenkin's a classic Zen text, quote-unquote classic. It's one of the only ones we have actually written by Zen masters. This is written by Mumen, who named himself after a case in a gaudy or haughty or lazy manner. Yeah, but let's get right into it. It's one of the shortest cases that do exist in the literature. So if you're wondering whether you want to stick around, you can take that into account. And Dan, if you want to read the case for us.
Definitely can do. So I will read the Sakita translation, since that is the one that we use for the title of the case. This is case 35 of the Mumonkan, or the Gateless Gate, translated by Sakita, called Seijo's Soul Separated, and it is this. Goso said to his monks, Seijo's soul separated from her being. Which was the real Seijo? Real short one. So I'll go ahead and just throw in Mumon's comment in verse at the top of it. Those who don't know, Mumon's the Zen master who compiled the Mumonkan. Pretty easy to remember by its name. Mumon's comment, when you realize what the real is, you will see that we pass from one husk to another, like travelers stopping for a night's lodging. Earth, water, fire, and air suddenly separate. You will be like a crab struggling in boiling water with its 7 or 8 arms and legs. When that happens, don't say I didn't warn you. And I'm actually going to keep the verse for later.
Okay, so there are a few points we could start a discussion, and I can bring them up. But if anyone has anything that they want to start with, now's the time to do it. Be brave.
Well, I actually am wondering if it might be beneficial for us to read this story from which the character in the case is sourced.
Seijo? The Seijo Soul thing?
Yeah, from the Sento Shinwa collection of stories.
I can just summarize the story. I also want to read Wonder Wheel's translation.
That sounds good. Summary and then Wonder Wheel. I think that's a good idea.
Father has a beautiful daughter. Father makes jokes about beautiful daughter one day marrying cousin. Cousin and beautiful daughter fall in love because they take the joke seriously. Father announces daughter's going to marry someone else. Cousin leaves in a huff. On a boat ride, cousin sees beautiful daughter on the boat with him. They go off, get married, have a family. Beautiful daughter misses her father, decides to go home for a visit. She comes back. They find the father in the beautiful daughter's old bedroom with the beautiful daughter's body lying in the bed. Body gets up off the bed and merges with the beautiful daughter. The two people become one person. And everybody realizes that her soul had been separate from her body for this whole time. End of story.
Can we get a quick recap of that? So the daughter leaves, marries the guy, then comes to see her dad, and then sees her body lying with her dad's corpse.
Well, the guy comes home, the husband that the daughter left with comes home to the dad without the daughter, and he sees that the daughter is there, but she's non-responsive. And then he's like, wait, but how can that be her? And he goes back to her on the boat. He gets her. He takes her back to the house again to see her dad herself. And she sees herself lying in the bed. And then the two walk together and they merge into one person. So the idea being that the one that was with this guy the whole time on the boat was some sort of sub-carnal, like
Her soul.
her soul basically
Yeah.
wandering around without the real body, but with some other sort of half astral body or something. But there was, clearly a visible body there.
In one version of the story, this astral version has children. So it's not a simple, like, ghost story type story.
So basically, all her kids are entangled.
Blythe says, thus what we have, strictly speaking, is a body and its soul with another body. Goso's question seems to imply that there was another sleeping soul that remained behind with the body, so that we get two persons, one with a material body and a super spiritual soul, and another with a soul and a sort of submaterial body.
For the sake of the listener, what's the connection here between the story and the case? Is this a Chinese lore that has been...
The girl who's separated into two beings in this story is the girl in question. In the
Seijo.
question that Goso asks.
What's the story from?
It's just like a story from a collection of stories, like
It's like the Three Little Pigs.
It's a Chinese
Yeah.
story?
Yeah.
folktale.
And her name is Seijo.
The name of the story is Li Hun Ji, or Record of the Departed Soul, or The Severed Soul.
All right, so do you want to do Wonder Wheels?
Here's Wonder Wheel's translation. Wu Zu questioned the monk, saying, Qianu parted from her higher soul. Which one is the true shelter? A woman says, if within you are able to awaken to your true shelter, then you know going out of the husk and entering the husk is like spending the night in a travel lodge. If you are maybe not yet exactly like that, then do not travel about in confusion. If suddenly like that, earth, water, fire, and air all scatter, then you are like a crab falling into hot water with 7 hands and 8 feet. At that time, don't say that I did not speak. Woman's poem is, clouds and moon are the same. Mountain streams and mountains are each different. 10,000 blessings, 10,000 blessings. It's one, it's two.
Okay, so the story adds obviously some more starting points we could do in discussion. Do we want to start there?
Yeah. I just want to say, while we were reading the story, or while the story was being explained, the thought came to mind, follow your heart. Her heart wanted to go with him. Her soul wanted to be with him, but her body was put in this other position.
This story seems very relevant to the idea of soulmates.
What sort of bearing do you think that has on the case?
Well, I think that there's perhaps this idea of some kind of essence of who I might be or who another person might be that maybe people are conceptualizing, and they take that same sort of essence being that they might have and apply it to another person that they love. And they think that there's a connection that's on a deeper level beyond just the superficial body connection that might happen. And so there's this sense of like, my deepest essence is connecting to someone else's deepest essence. And it seems like an interesting case to ask about, like, well, what is the deepest essence? What is the true shelter?
Well, I mean, also we just have like a story that we can imagine, at least I'm just going to assume a decent number of people in China knew. And it just introduces this principle of mind versus soul. And he's like, okay, this is a useful thing to talk about the metaphysics that people might bring to Zen.
Well, one thing about metaphysics that is noted in, generally nodded towards in this Blythe comment on the case, is just ideas of duality. He says, the problem is therefore just an interesting form of the question, which is the real one, life or death, I or the universe, past and present, good and evil, ugly and beautiful, enlightenment and illusion. And I think it's interesting that this story is premised clearly on this idea of there being ways to divide up being, to divide up what the person is, whether that's into, mind and body, which is something the Western world is pretty familiar with, thanks to Descartes. Or, as this Blythe comment also says, it's a culturally familiar idea here for there to be several entities involved, multiple souls, multiple bodies. Like, that's a pretty familiar idea here from where the story is being written. And the question of the case here, when he asks which was the real person, I think it's interesting to consider what you're saying, Dan, right? Like this experience of follow your heart and what happens when you don't follow your heart. If you can make a metaphorical application of this story to your experience, we all have experienced internal conflict and stuff. And when you have that issue, when I have that issue, who's the real person there in that experience, right? Like at the end of that, if you ask yourself that question, if you were to look at this in your own experience of some time when you've been torn into multiple people like this, maybe, or have felt that way, or have created a story about yourself feeling that way, where do you find the real person?
I think the end is interesting, but I think you're making a mistake in the beginning. This is a fairy tale that has nothing to do with Zen. And Zen Master says, okay, so which one's the real person? I don't think he's saying that the fairy tale is true, or that the fairy tale is false, or that the fairy tale is even a common experience people have. I think he's asking a question that is a trap. And the question is not only how are you going to address it, but also how does Woman address it? Because remember, Woman is using the case, which is a trap, as a trap. So there's a lot of trickery going on there, I think.
The first thing I was thinking when I read this, so I heard the Sakita translation being said, and it's different than the Wonder Wheel and the Blythe. And on all of them, in Mumon's comment, I was like, are the Zen Masters implying that for some reason, out of nowhere, in no themes I've ever seen in any other cases, that the soul goes from body to body or something? Like the husks, then going out of the husk and entering the husk is like spending the night in a travel lodge. It just really sounds like we're really into this weird supernatural reincarnation zone suddenly. But then the last part of it, it changes. And he says, at that time, don't say that I did not speak, which to me is like one of the best Zen lines I've heard, actually.
You and you both pointed out that sort of subjunctive mood versus imperative mood, that they play on the verb mood on multiple levels. Who are they talking to, etc. But the reincarnation thing, we probably should address. So good on you for bringing it up, because I mean, even if you did a quick Google on this case, I bet you would see that, right? Like, hey, does this mean Zen believes in reincarnation?
And I think also related to the idea of no self too, that pops up in Buddhism. So like, if there's no self, what's reincarnated? I think those two things.
I think that's a big conversation we might get into as well, because there's a little bit of nuance there, and it's definitely a very popular idea. But for the things that stick out for me that just obviously separate it from the reincarnation story. One, Zen masters rarely talk about reincarnation, and that's pretty much all that needs to be said. But there's also some clues within the logic of the case, like stopping for a night's lodging calls back to other Zen memes like guest and host and
Travels by night.
Yeah, so and that kind of calls back to that meme there and separates it from, when you die, you're going into another body, and your body is just a husk. It definitely separates it, I think, from a substance dualism type thing, just by the logic alone. And then we can also look at, if you're a listener and you're new to Zen, Zen masters don't talk about reincarnation in the way that you think they might, ever.
And there's really nothing even in the story to suggest reincarnation, right?
You'd have to come in with an idea that Zen somehow has to do with reincarnation to get that far even.
There's no indication that anybody takes the story seriously.
Yeah, that's why I was saying before, it seems like it's just a story that he knows everybody knows. And I'll be like, this case specifically, especially with that husk, it makes me think of, and I forget the Zen master who said it, the question, who is it dragging that corpse around? And I don't think it's necessarily so much to do with death specifically, so much as because in the commentary talking about coming and going from the husk, so much as, I mean, the default person, right, normally begins with like, who am I? They're going to think the body, or at least to start with, right? I assume that's the default that people start with. I am this body because evolutionarily, this is the thing that I want to die so that I can make copies of it. And so at a surface level, this is at least getting into the mind-body problem, essentially, or at least baiting people to pick one side or the other.
Yeah, it's definitely a bait, right? And like you keeps pointing out, there is debate to take the story seriously. And in his time, it probably wasn't take the story seriously because it was probably known to just be a story. But it maybe more precise would be to take a moral lesson connected to the story seriously. Like, this is what we usually think this story means in China. And then we would do the same here.
Yeah.
Which would be what? Your real self is not your body, right? That's what feels good. That's what would be the obvious sort of moral message if we took the story to mean a moral message with the Zen master giving his push behind that idea.
If he said that, right? But he leaves it as a question.
Right.
You know, which one was the three? And again, this makes me think of Tosotsu's Three Barriers, which is case 47, the Mumonkan. And it says, when you have freed yourself from life and death, you know where you're going. When the four elements separate, where are you off to? That's the third barrier. And Tosotsu's second barrier is when you realize what your nature is, you are free from life, free from death. When the light of your eyes is falling, how can you be free from them? Which is on a cursory view. When you die, where are you? And then the third one's like, forget the body entirely, forget the elements entirely. What are you? And so I see this as just, you know, which one was the real Seijo? Was the boy or Gutai the real Gutai when Gutai cut off his finger? Referencing an earlier episode for our listeners.
And Moomin doesn't really, as you said, doesn't answer this for us. And in fact, the biggest clue he gives is when you realize what real is, which is just, that's a tautology. It's nothing. He directs us nowhere.
Are you saying that real is nothing, or are you saying that his comment?
His comment doesn't direct us to which thing is real. He just says, well, realize what real is, and then you will X. If we can see X, maybe we can reverse engineer, right? So you will be able to pass from one husk to another like travelers stopping for a night's lodging. So I mentioned...
my girlfriend sometimes... Oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I want to hear
I'll
about
say
your
this
girlfriend, obviously.
I mean, yeah, it makes her happy when I drop her in the podcast. But no, she'll sometimes be like, when you talk about yourself in third person, it makes me real uncomfortable. And I'm like, but I'm not like talking about myself third person like Douglas MacArthur, like, right? So it's like, 20-year-old Dan was doing XYZ. And she's counting that. I'm like, no, because I'm counting a totally different Dan in that scenario. She's like, that's so weird. I'm like, well, I'm speaking Dan because I'm talking about the personality. Talking about that, which is not the same as the me. The me is going to, the self is unchanging. But in sociology, we have this concept of roles and going from role to role. It's something everybody does. I think it's common for a lot of teenagers and then early young adults to ask, what's the real me? Am I the real me when I'm here or there? Taking on different roles, taking on different... You get what I'm trying to say.
So like the opposite of stopping for a night's lodging is like living, right? Staying, not moving. But this is
tackling yourself.
Yeah, this is going somewhere at night and leaving in the morning. And, we can reverse engineer that. So what would we need to consider real for that to be the case?
What do you mean by that? Are you asking what is an example of something that would suffice this real? Or are you asking what is real in terms of like what would satisfy the definition of real?
Well, that's part of the question. So all I'm saying is looking at Moomin's single sentence right here with the rest of it not gone, but in a periphery, we have real is something. You can realize it. And then we have, if you do, this happens. So if we start at what this happens is, can we look back and see what he means by realizing the real?
So the word real is real loaded, right? And we said that the moment that the word came up. In cicadas, we have, when you realize what the real is, you'll see that we pass from one husk to another, like travelers stopping by for a night's lodging. Now we have in Blythe, the translation is, if you are enlightened concerning what real things are, as opposed to what the real is, Blythe says what real things are, you will know that we pass from one husk to another, blah, blah, blah. And then, now, again, we have Wonder Wheel, as is tradition, coming out of left field with this totally different phrasing, where he translates it as, if within you're able to awaken to your true shelter. So he doesn't even use the word real. He uses the word true, but he talks about a true shelter. True shelter equals real things equal the real. Do you guys want to go on board with that, or do you want to say there's a distinction?
Is Wonder Wheels also the only one that starts with if within? The other ones just say if you awaken or something like that?
Sakita says when you realize what the real is. And then Blythe says if you are enlightened concerning what the real things are.
Yeah, interesting.
The shelter does foreshadow stopping at the night's lodging. Right? So in Wonder Wheel seems to be the most literal. Otherwise, I would say that he's kind of looking at the latter part of the sentence and translating based on that. The logic of the sentence certainly remains with each one.
Well, it makes me think our last case where we talked about in Wonder Wheels, Buddha didn't say to Mahakashyapa, I'm giving you my Dharma eye. You're the Dharma eye. He says, I have the container of the Dharma eye, the true Dharma eye. And we have this true shelter. And so I would ask in this case, do we think that Muman is saying that the spending the night in the travel lodge, you can just make the travel lodge your true shelter? Or is there a true shelter that once you have that, you're like, oh, I can go anywhere and I still have the true shelter?
What is the shelter providing? Why do we even need a shelter in the first place? What am I sheltering myself from?
What are you sheltering yourself from?
Yeah, it's a good.
Or
I'm not
what
sure.
could you shelter yourself
It's interesting to me how that maybe
if you wanted
relates to the crab later. Like in the commentary later, it says, if suddenly like that earth, water, fire, and air all scatter, then you are like a crab falling into hot water with 7 hands and 8 feet. I mean, just imagining myself like going into boiling water where I'm going to just be cooked to death. Like, that's very graphic imagery, but I'm not sure how that necessarily translates into my world. I'm basically a little bit confused about that line and the meaning of it and maybe how it relates.
I just used the Googler to check how many legs crabs have, because I assumed it was 6 because they aren't spiders and insects have 6. But no, so apparently they have 10. But then there's this type, anomorans can be told apart by the number of legs. Crabs have 10 legs, including claws, while the last pair of anomorans legs are hidden inside the shell, so that only 8 are visible. So this dropped into hot water with 7 hands and 8 feet is essentially implying a crab that lost one of its claws.
Yamada has it as...
What are you saying about Mamada?
Yamada. He's a Japanese Buddhist. He says that his translation is, if you realize the true one in this, and I think that were to take, and I think the true one and the true shelter are all just the Buddha nature.
Yeah, I agree. Yuke, it was you, and I've quoted you on this. You said something at one point along the lines of, are there any secrets of the universe? If so, I've never seen any. Or something along those lines. And that came to mind when Kevin was asking, what would you take shelter from? Or Kevin asked, like, what is taking shelter? And I was like, what could you take shelter from? Can you take shelter from what is? Or is there anything to hide from?
As another footnote, Yamada notices this little, it's hard to tell where Woman is playing with us and where he isn't, but Zen Master in this case, Goso or whatever what is Wonder Wheel?
Mizu.
Yeah. His name is the same name as the name of the 5th patriarch because they're from the same mountain. So we have a guy whose name is the same as somebody else's name asking about whether somebody with 2 different selves, which one is the real self. That's pretty funny.
I hadn't thought of that. I like that. I don't know if he had that in mind, but it's definitely, I like it.
It's interesting you bring up the 5th patriarch because this case reminds me a lot of the 6th patriarch's poem about nowhere for dust to cling versus the other poem that his poem was sort of in response to, where you have to polish the mirror and the mirror stand is there. I can't remember exactly, but there's a stand that the mirror is sitting on, and that stand is almost like this sort of trap of a shelter, and polishing it is like a trap that you get stuck in, kind of.
I've been trying to upgrade all my barbarian armor in Breath of the Wild. Well, actually, I succeeded, quick brag, in Breath of the Wild today before we did this. And I had to get these dragon scales. And the Zelda fans out there will know what I'm talking about. And so I had to make a lot of fires and sit by the fires to get the timing right. So I was taking shelter all over the map in this game while sitting in my armchair. Pretty cool. Traveling all around while sitting in my armchair. So which one was the true shelter, right? Where I was staying in the game or my apartment? Or is there an even more true shelter? Or maybe I might ask, is there more true shelter?
With these kind of prompts, we can sort of segue into what Kevin mentioned earlier, which is we can talk about maybe some of the interpretations which you might see if you're Googling or actually in common Buddhist philosophy, people who look back on this case, no matter what their religious standings are, and interpret it. And a lot of it comes from the lens of one thing being real and the other thing not being real, with this weird idea of delusion that they sort of argue about in-house all the time, right? So there's some conversation there, I think, if we can address maybe some of these ideas which you might easily find about the idea of realness and what people usually think of when they think about Zen. Right, so on a very basic level, you have the kind of substance dualism, which we mentioned already, where your mind is separate from your body, and you have a true self, which is not the body chained down to the ground, right? A kind of even like slave morality sort of thing, like. And it gets more complicated with, well, actually, it's not unreal, it's just illusory and stuff like that.
And what does illusory even mean at a certain point?
Yeah, it sort of seems to imply that there's a real thing that you can see, and then what your brain is constructing is this fake hallucination all the time. But there's still that implicit, there's a real truth out there that you can access.
I mean, yeah, and it's to deny your Buddha nature, I would say, to say that what you see is illusory, just what you see. And this brings me back to that fog metaphor that I used, where it's like, I might not be able to see you across a field if there's fog, but I can see what I'm seeing is in full resolution. I'm just fog. I might not be seeing your body.
That's really apt, I think, because it's similar to the first line of the poem. Clouds and moon are the same. But I think that's a really great analogy, Dan, and I like how that links to that line.
If you consider one thing unreal and the other real, then that's almost the manifestation of the visual of staying in one place, right? Or avoiding a certain spot. It's not getting at night and leaving in the morning. It's not checking out and traveling and staying places. Because there will be spots you'll actively avoid, right? There'll be, and then if we're talking about self, those spots that you're actively avoiding are you, right? So, I mean, it really can kind of, in a way, be boiled down to a self-hate, self-criticism, when you start separating parts of yourself as real and unreal.
Yeah, that wasn't me, babe. I'm sorry. I wasn't in my right mind. You know, compare that with like, oh, that was dumb of me.
Blame it on the alcohol, man.
Yeah, blame it on the. I mean, you could say I was super drunk, but it is more likely, just from an efficiency standpoint, to prompt you to like not do a dumb thing again if you actually think it's dumb, as opposed to like, nope, it wasn't me. In psychology, we have what's called dissociation.
So what does Moomin mean when he says, if you do not realize it, right, that's easy. I earnestly advise you to not rush about wildly, in the Sakita translation. What does he advise us to not do if we don't realize it?
I mean, I might say, if you want to make a conceptual understanding of like, oh, the true self's indestructible, so I can go, do whatever I want. I can go rob a bank. I can go, eat pizza. It's like, no, these are shameful things. Don't do them. No, I'm just kidding.
You know what it makes me think of is when in Nansen's Ordinary Mind in the Mumikin, Joshu says, in Wonder Wheel's translation, as we talked about, I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, if I aggressively face every obstruction, will I realize it? Right? So,
do I have to go on Fear Factor?
Yeah, and you get the idea of the Roomba, right? Which is like, I just have to meet everything head on and speak out and figure this out and expel the unreal from me or from things. If I feel better or if I feel like something's not right, then I need to be on it, expel it, rush about.
Yeah, I think that relates a lot to spiritual practices that pop up. Like, for example, like, oh, I feel so stressed out, so I just need to meditate more and more frequently. And so you keep meditating, but then you end up getting like anxious when you don't meditate.
I think there's language precision that you could apply to your example there. I might say that they're not really feeling like they should meditate more. They think they need to meditate more in order to blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And language precision of feel versus
Yeah.
think really makes a difference if you go hardcore on it. I'm not saying you were inaccurate, saying they are inaccurate, this hypothetical person.
I mean, you can have a conditioned feeling about it, though. I mean, if you think about it for long enough in that way, I think you start to respond in a less intellectual way with that response. Like people who are addicted to going to the gym or addicted to whatever, you know, I think that it's possible to mistake it in its purpose and have that be a form of abuse in that you're not actually seeking out the right things that will alleviate your issue.
Yeah, like what are you seeking shelter from, like Dan said earlier. And I think it's sort of the opposite swing of the pendulum for going and robbing a bank, like you were talking about, Dan.
So let's suppose that I have PTSD, but I become enlightened. Can I still have PTSD while I'm enlightened? Can I still be triggered from enlightenment? And so if I know that I have certain triggers, like suppose I have fireworks or triggers, if I'm enlightened and I intentionally don't go to the barbecue where there's going to be fireworks, am I being not Zen when I do that? Or can I not go to the fireworks knowing that it's going to trigger me? Can I not want to go and stay at the lodge there because I know it'll give me flashbacks? Is that an avoiding reality or not?
It's sort of analogous to what I was saying, where you get the religious types who maybe use speech as like the expulsion method.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So your example was, is this trigger mean I'm not enlightened or not Zen, having that trigger? There's a religious type who might have this trigger and then they do attend to it, but in an expulsion sort of way. So they're wild about it, as Moomin says. I need to get rid of this. And meditating's another example of this for the easier corollary there. They are attending to this feeling, but they're not looking at the reality that Moomin is. They're looking at the feeling, as you mentioned. It's a feeling, right? This feeling of, well, we'll bring up original sin again, of impurity. Are you catching the corollary there?
I definitely grok.
Yeah, polishing the mirror. You got to keep polishing it.
Right. So in this case, the person who's getting triggered by the fireworks would be like, no, I need to go to the fireworks because we can leave the cuz off. But yeah.
Which is, if they're doing it because they think that they should to be good, right? It's one thing. But, you know, they could go to the fireworks and be like, no, I think this will be useful. Or they can abstain from it. And I think they can be perfectly Zen either way when they're not ignoring the reality of the trigger. You know, it's like trying to be like, no, it's not a thing. It's not a thing. Or even it's a thing, and so I must destroy it because it's in the way of me being me. And it's like, well, sorry, bro. You're kind of the definition of it.
I think that what you just described, Dan, relates really well to the second line of the poem. Mountain streams and mountains are each different. It kind of reminds me of that famous saying, like, at first, mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. And then mountains are not mountains, and rivers are not rivers. And then again, mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. And I think that talking about the trigger, you can be in that space of like, okay, this thing is going to upset me and I have to destroy it, is kind of like mountains are not mountains. I need to destroy this. Or that kind of relates to the idea of like the earth and the water and the fire and the air all scattering. But when you realize that it's a trigger, like you said, just knowing that it's a trigger and knowing that not going would mean that I wouldn't be triggered, but also going either way, either direction could still be perfectly Zen.
And you can imagine a lot of people in the thought trap.
The inherent problem with the PTSD question is what happens when somebody's PTSD gets treated and they don't have a problem going to fireworks anymore. There's a change in them that you have to sort of compare and contrast to the question of what enlightenment is. But I want to pause on that and jump back to something that was said near the beginning, which was that Wooman doesn't clarify the question or address the question. Somebody said something about that, and I don't think that's true. And I think the way that you can see this is that the end of his commentary, he says, in a couple of translations, not all of them, but in some of the translations, it's translated as, "Don't say I didn't warn you." So I think that's a clue that he has addressed the Muzu question.
It's asked, which one was her real self? And then Mumon just begins to like, okay, I forget this instantiation. If you know what real is, what makes something real or not real, or even if that dichotomy works. And I think that's what he's doing.
If you don't know, don't rush around is the warning, right?
Yeah. If you're not enlightened, don't rush about wildly.
So then the question is, he has a warning for people who are not enlightened, but does that warning solve the question that Muzu is posing?
I don't think so. He gives a self-verification and gives a comment on it, in the Morse code that we see in so much commentary on the koans.
I'm going to reread a comment from Blythe that I read, just a sentence. The problem is therefore just an interesting form of the question, which is the real one? Life or death, I or the universe, past and present, good and evil, ugly and beautiful, enlightenment and illusion. And you have to ask if this is being compared to those questions in what they do, how they function, right? Which is, as we see in Zen commentary, addressing the dualism that people imagine the world to have, and where is the place where those dualisms are unified? What's the thing that is unchanging through all of those questions of this or that, of picking and choosing? What's the thing that's left over always? And is the true shelter even amongst those things in the weeds?
I guess tagging on to what you're saying, Cherished, don't travel about wildly, or do not travel about in confusion. Body and mind are sort of being made into these two separate places, and you can jump back and forth. But going to that line that Wuman said in the commentary, do not travel about in confusion, you're not traveling if it's all just one thing.
Don't panic.
I earnestly advise you to not rush about wildly. Is both or either a warning or an answer. If we talk about he did give us clues, then that would be a big one.
All right, yeah, so I'm going to steel man that it is an answer and see what I can come up with.
It is? Oh, okay.
I'm going to steel man that it is, and we'll see what happens.
Problem is here, I think the translations differ quite a bit.
Going back to the do not travel about in confusion, I think that would be the answer, Steelman. And I think
travel there is relevant, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. And this relates back to like a Wei Ning quote, which he says in the Platform Sutra. He's like, Zen is not being confused about inside and outside, or something like that. So I wonder if that relation of confusion and that traveling between these two ideas relates in some sense to that kind of idea.
Can you elaborate?
Okay, so Wenning said, and what do we mean by Zen meditation? Externally to be free is Zen, and internally to not be confused is meditation. I think that relationship of external and internal is one of those dichotomies that we were talking about, like a true shelter and a not true shelter, going in and out, and relating that back to do not travel about in confusion. I think that you can easily think about everything that you're seeing as being outside of yourself. Like one thing that my partner says to me if I'm anxious, she says, the anxiety is not in the room.
So good.
And that's a good reminder.
Yeah, it's so grounding, right? When you're like, oh, wait, it's not that the universe suddenly got terrible. It's that I'm anxious.
Right, exactly. And that relates to something you've said before, Dan, that I really like, which is the rain is not ruining your day. The rain is you ruining your day.
I am literally looking up a Foyen story as we speak. So I'm glad that we can alley-oop into Foyen. I said that like last week, too.
So I'm going to return to the question then. Is woman answering Wuzu? And I've argued that the second part, the warning, is for people who aren't enlightened. So I'm now going to argue that the first part is woman answering Wuzu. So woman says that the enlightened person is like a traveler staying in an inn. So then the question is, Wuzu asks, which is the real Seijo? And I guess woman's answer is going to be, well, which Seijo is the traveler?
I was thinking about that. I was wondering how much the traveling had to do with her leaving, coming back.
So we agree that Seijo wasn't enlightened, right?
Yeah, I'm going to guilty until proven innocent.
So then, the parts separate. So there's more than one thing because you have a bunch of parts. Earth, water, fire, and air are all separated. But if you're enlightened, then you're only one traveler.
I have the Mumonkan open right in front of me to Kaicho's wheel, which is case 3. It's real short. Gessen said to a monk, Kaicho made 100 carts. If we took the wheels and removed the axle, what would then be obvious? And I opened that after Micah, you said that, what's left when you take it all away? When you remove all these parts, when you move the elements, what's left? If you take off the wheels and remove the axle, what's left?
I think it's hard to even talk about from such a way that talks about objects, because I think it neglects the sort of subjectiveness of the thing, right? And I think I have like a pretty rudimentary understanding of the Christian Holy Trinity, but I think the idea that there's this spirit that lies between the metaphorical body and self and then the world, like somewhere in between there is this spirit, this like the interaction between them. So what if you are that? What if you are that, in between thing? Then really it looks like instead of it being in between them, between the self and the world, you actually subsume them, from your perspective. They exist only in your experience. And I think for me, that's the thing about the cart, that example that they give often in Buddhist texts. Like, I think it just doesn't do justice, I don't think, to the feeling of it's not like you're looking at an object, not entirely, at least. That's half the picture or something.
So I think if I take that and I add it to what I'm saying. So woman says, if you're enlightened, then you're just a traveler going from inn to inn. And we agree that Seijo is not enlightened and that her parts have been separated. And so when we ask what Goso or Wuzu's question, what the answer is that woman is proposing, Wuzu is saying, well, which one's the real one? And woman's saying, if they're separated into parts, then they're all the real one. But since she's not enlightened, none of them are the real one.
Right. It seems like it's 3, but it's actually 1. But also,
Yeah, if you don't have poetic license, it's not a poem, right? So if she's not enlightened, she can't say what is and what isn't real. She would just be, we go back to Joshu's, the Dharma uttered by a sincere man, even if it's false Dharma, becomes true, and vice versa. There's the case where the one Zen master is like, yeah, the body's covered with eyes and hands. And the Zen master's like, I don't think so. And he's like, oh, what do you think? He's like, throughout the body are eyes and hands. They don't say there's no eyes or hands. They don't say there's one eye or one hand, right? So once you get that poetic license of knowing what you're talking about from enlightenment, then you can say what is and isn't.
I think the other things that are worth sort of over focusing on are first that the origin of this case is a fairy tale. And secondly, that woman's warning is against rushing around, but that's both physical and intellectual rushing around, which suggests that the problem arises when unenlightened people try to say what is true.
Regardless of its relation, I'm sure a lot of people, their first thought's going to be Socrates on this one. People who say they know what's true when they don't. And we know that this was an issue during Mumon's time. We see a lot of reasons that a lot of people were pretending to be Zen masters in monasteries. It's not stuff dissimilar to today. There were tax loopholes and they got free rice and stuff like that back and forth in China during these times. And I like that you're focusing on this Mumon's warning in this, because it's one that I kind of glanced over, granted, probably because it's the middle sentence in the paragraph, but it's definitely worth looking at if we assume that, because the enlightened person, they're already going to have what they have, right? And Blythe adds in brackets, after like a crab with its 7 arms and 8 legs and boiling water, you struggle. So we might just say like, hey, if you don't and you try and do it, you're going to struggle, but don't say I didn't warn you. And I almost wonder if he means as bait, like maybe that'll enlighten somebody. Maybe somebody will be struggling and they'll think of this and that'll pop.
Or maybe it's more the case of when you find yourself struggling, remember I told you not to do that, and STFU.
You don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all.
I would say something even better. As Watsky said, if you got nothing nice to say, then don't be nice.
There's a real, I think, cruelty to this case. I mean, if you look at the various commentaries that translators have made, there's a flavor of desperation to them. They just don't know what to do with it. They all tell the story of Seijo, and then they're like, and yet in the few sentences that Wuman has here, it seems like he's dealing with it really elegantly, and that's where I think the viciousness is evident, right? He's showing off, but it's not just that, it's that all these other people who try to take up the case are struggling. And similarly, if a Zen master's told a story like the 3 little pigs and then asked a question about the 3 little pigs that nobody was comfortable answering, I think that's just rubbing people's nose in it.
Okay, now I see what you meant by the viciousness. I was playing with some various ways you could have meant that. Yeah, it is a bit of a dangling in front of you kind of deal. And I'm breezing through these translations cursory, trying to view them to see if I see struggling in them. And Blythe does rely more on quotes and poetry than he typically does. And he does do what I call worshiping Dionysus. But he ends it with a line from, I assume, Wordsworth. All that we behold is full of blessings. And so even if you're struggling, are you beholding blessings? Or is your realization that you're beholding blessings required for you to be beholding blessings? Does the girl have to be enlightened for both to be real? We seem to say earlier that she does. If she's not enlightened, then they're not both real. Her real self.
Well, I would say that Wuman's poem is almost like an apology for the preceding cruelty, because he says, okay, you think moon and clouds are different, but they're the same. And you know that mountains and valleys are really the same thing, but no, they're different. And isn't it all just wonderful anyway? Can't we just still have a nice day? And then he ends with a knife twist, which is, this is one, that is two, which is a huge, it's like, why did Bodhidharma cross the sea? The question of whether there is a one and a two and who gets to say what's one and what's two, he just puts that in here at the end of the poem. And the implication is Seijo was happy with or without her body/soul.
I think there's heavy emphasis on the this is one, that is two. And I like that you called it a knife twist, especially after saying what a happy thing it all is. The moon and the clouds are the same, when of course the moon and the cloud are not the same. But when they're that, according to the logic of this poem, they are not the same. But when they're this, then they are the same.
I was thinking this is one that is two is like a statement philosophically on subjective and objective reality. Because the confusion is always about how does one and two coexist, right? Because they're contradictory, sort of. Because the moon among the clouds is ever the same. That would represent objective universality, unchanging, real outside of you, right? And then valleys and mountains are in constant change. Valleys and mountains are in constant change. Are they, though, as much as the moon? I mean, they're pretty much not. They're both fixtures that are permanent, giant, and outside of yourself. So why is one in constant change and one is ever the same? I think it's just a metaphor, because valleys and mountains happen to change more, and the moon kind of always is this little thing in the sky that looks the same. And then he accepts it all in the third line. What a happy thing it all is. Like, this isn't a bad thing. This is awesome. You just got to get it. And then he labels it again.
I mean, the feeling that I get from this is up is down, bitches. Isn't that nice? Oh, and by the way, I can tell the difference. And I will throw in here, too, that as far as I understand it, the Blue Cliff Record and the Book of Serenity are written kind of in the abstract. Both are Zen masters, both are writing, but they're really long pieces that they took time to write. Whereas the Gateless Barrier is what he came up with while he was yelling at people.
What do you mean? Like he came up with one on the job or something?
Well, Woman explicitly introduces this book as something that emerged from the daily activity of the monastery. As he's yelling at people, he's writing this down on his notepad, right? So if you will accept my argument that he is much crueler or more vicious in this text than the other two masters are in their texts, I would say that one of the reasons for this is that this text emerged from the day-to-day teaching, whereas those two texts, the masters had more time to themselves, and it was them writing more than it was them screaming and you writing on their notepad.
I had never heard that idea. I had never heard that Muman basically made his own sayings text. And that explains so much of the laziness that me and Brian have talked about of Muman's comments half the time. And yeah, this laconicness that he'll sometimes have, this makes a lot of sense. That's useful to know. This is one, that is two. That's a real mic drop in a way that Muman leaves us with. And it's interesting, right? This is basically a technically two sentence, but really just like a one-liner case. But there's so much to talk about here. I feel like half of that's because it's such a ubiquitous thing. I mean, to speak heavily in the weeds, essentially the mind-body problem. Or at least being baited as such, like I said earlier. And that this and that is really cool. And so let's do what we like to do. I think we'll eventually come up with like a fun little mini song that we can play for when we read all three translations of the same line. We'll make it its own segment. So we have the one that we keep repeating from Blythe, the end of Muman's verse. And just because it's been a sec, I'll read the whole verse for this one at least. The moon among the clouds is ever the same. Valleys and mountains are in constant change. What a happy thing it all is. This is one, that is two. All right, so that's Blythe's, and let's focus on that last line, and let's look at Sakita's. Sakita says, well, I'll say the last two lines. All are blessed, all are blessed. Are they one or are they two? Very different. And then Wonder Wheel says, it's one, it's two. So Blythe is the only one who seems to make the distinction of this is one, that is two. Whereas Wonder Wheel says, it's one, it's two. And then Sakita says, are they one or are they two? So we have some competitors. We have three talking about one and two. 7, 8, 9.
Yeah, I would be interested to know some of the tricks of the translating trade in this manner. Like, what is the confusion between, and maybe you can answer this, when there's a question in one translation and a comment in another, although they are the same line?
That's one nice thing about math, is one is going to mean the same thing across every language. She one, she two. Obviously, it's not one and two, but so it is the same character in that line, and she's basically like is. There's a bunch of ises, but it's like the first is you'll come across in Chinese. And so Blythe's kind of taking some translator poetic license, saying this is one, that is two in that. However, I'm willing to give him that.
To put it really probably on a low level, and of course, hey, if you know about this, hit us up. This would be something we'd be interested in just as a trivia piece. So we have is one, is two, and then we're trying to decode whether it's where the this is, right? This is one or is this one? I like what you brought up about how they're sort of speeches, right? And then I think even in the Blue Cliff record, I was going to add, like, they give the image of Yan Wu in the mountains by himself, scribbling furiously. And of course, I'm adding to that, but that is sort of the vibe. But if you think of Moomin or Blythe or whoever, Blythe kind of writes in that style, speaking these things, they sort of make sense as a command that's a question.
Yeah, you've talked so much about the imperative mood, the subjunctive mood with Mumon especially. This explains so much of that.
It does, doesn't it? I love this picture. This is great. And I want to do some research in it myself just to kind of check up on it before I start doing it. But I'm going to put that in my pocket and I'm going to hand it to people all the time. That really helps the picture of when you're giving a statement in front of an audience and then, you know, maybe you pause for a few seconds. It's a lot different than just writing a statement down.
Oh, yeah. Oratory is very different than written word. As we're all learning as we use oratory to talk about these Zen cases. My first week of the first class I ever had with that professor I always bring up, the second class, this kid is like, so like for problem 3 on the homework, and I'm like, this kid's looked at the homework already? It's been one day. Mind blown by this. Anyways, he's like, how do like this one part? And so Gerace, the professor, just like stops for a second and then looks at him and said, what is your name? And then the kid goes, oh, Taylor Expansion. That's when I was like, hey, what the fuck is this? This guy's Zen master looking motherfucker. But in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the oratory style used, right? Like that wouldn't work written. That only works with instantaneous communication. In before people want to say all communication's instantaneous. Sure, but yeah, speaking in front of an audience.
It's communication with social pressure added in.
Yeah, to be understood.
Or even if it's on a one-on-one, you know, that pressure still exists. That gets into the kind of like, for people who maybe you're just discovering these cases or whatever, or maybe you're just full of shit and you're a shithead.
Maybe both.
Yeah, maybe both. But usually shitheads are the people who read these cases and then say stupid stuff about them. I was too busy thinking about whether it was good for me to say that or not on a recorded podcast.
How many people are going to use that in the reviews when they were like, these guys are making so many mental conceptions of koans.
Yeah, it's going to happen for sure.
These bros think that they can talk shit about Soto Zen. And I was like, gonna make a sassy monkeys a typewriters joke? Nah.
Look, and I'll say another thing that'll get us bad reviews, but we just got to get our family members to counteract the trolls.
Well, no, because I'm real explicit. The listeners, you guys know what I'm talking about. Like I say, the end of the podcast. If you like the podcast and you're going to leave a good review, leave a review. But don't leave a review if it's going to be better. It's not useful. It's only useful to know what I'm doing well, right? Or to know that I'm doing well. It's not useful to know how I grew.
What I was going to say that I forgot as I was figuring out if the situation arises, and I'll say that again next time, is when the Zen masters are always like, say something quick, say something spontaneous. A huge factor in that is what we were just talking about, right?
I mean, we see him jump down, grab them by their sleeves, and shake them and say, "Speak, speak."
Like it's in a hall. It's not even actually. I mentioned it works one-on-one, but it's not even ever done one-on-one in the koans. I think it's exclusively done in lecturing halls and stuff like that.
The ones where it is one-on-one, like it's stated, which shows that it's assumed that it won't be. When it's like a monk ass Joshu, when it's a monk ass, it's either there is no monk. There are no monks of the Eastern and Western Hall. It's just Nansen trying to figure out, do I want to spade or neuter my cat? Or it's presumably a monk among other monks in the hall. And I like that you brought that up because it explains a lot of his focus on the warning. And I think that's what led us into that. Is Mumon, how many shitheads, quote unquote, does he see? Like in one of the previous episodes where we talked about the monk who got up to challenge Joshu, then he just challenged him again. It's like, all right, if you don't know what you're doing, just chill out. Like, you're just struggling.
That's a good parallel to that case, or to that line.
I do wonder if he just says 7 out of 8 to say it's struggling, or if there's this cool hidden thing there of like, you're not using your 8th. You have 8 legs and you're trying to use 7 as arms, and so you're unbalanced because you're not allowing yourself to use all of them. Or you're trying to use your arms as legs and vice versa. Because crabs don't have 8 legs and 8 arms. They have 8 legs and 7 arms. And that might be going into the weeds, but like, I'm down with some marine biology.
Now, this is taking it further than I think is warranted by the logic of the situation. But if we continue to play with the idea of him standing up, and you can imagine, like, now I'm making a character out of him that is not seeable within the text. So I'm taking liberty. He has spittle, right? And he's yelling and he's angry or something. Zen masters get angry, and some of them love it. They even say so themselves.
Yeah, there's a case with Yunmin, who's considered, the most elegant of all of them. There's a saying, and it's just, he came into the hall, and then he stopped for a second, then he chased all the monks out with his staff. Actually, it happens pretty often.
Yeah, right? There's literally, he says, I like being angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a great pleasure it is to be angry and agree with your anger.
Yeah, relevant to the case.
Definitely.
But I imagine Spittle, and then 7, he fucked up, right? He's like, he just forgot how much legs a crab has. And so he corrects himself. 7, and in the Sakita version, it's 7 or 8.
Oh, is it
7
really?
or 7 or 8 arms, whatever. You get it.
Crabs actually have 10 arms. It's Armunas who have 8. Like, Mumon just goes and just, like, throws him out of the mountain. What did I say last episode? I was like, it's Dan here. I'm going to go throw dogs at people. Some shit. All right, so let's think about this, right? Let's definitively try to answer this. So, Micah, and I'm not saying you have to say, like, A, B, C, or D, right? So I'm going to ask you, say is being separated from her soul. Which was the real person?
My impulse is to respond with something like, I don't want to answer this question. But if I'm going to actually just try to give one of the 2 answers.
You don't have to give one of 2 answers. That's why I said this is an A, B, C, or D question.
It's rather one of, like, nearly infinity answers, right?
As Watsky said, infinity ways to say what I mean.
Just word association, or?
I use Watsky a lot when talking about Zen in real life. Do I think Watsky studies Zen is enlightened? No, but I steal his words a lot for teaching.
I don't understand how one of the people is more or less real than the other one. I think that's my answer.
Are you more true to yourself when you're high, drunk, or sober?
All 3.
Are you ever untrue to yourself?
No.
Suppose that you got blackout drunk and you beat up your mom last night. What would you say about that? take that as both. What do you say about that, comma, Micah? Is then me asking you, Micah, or what do you say about that Micah, as opposed to this Micah, if there is this opposed to?
I think I want to retroactively change my answer to your first question.
You want the answer to be the question?
No, I want the answer to your first question to be, I refuse to answer your question.
Just sitting home? Just because you actually beat up your mom last night when you were blackout drunk?
I plead the fifth.
No, man. Hey, man, she asked me to. She's trying to learn how to fight, man.
I think that there is some good, sensible, poetic, fun truth here that is super obvious and easily interpretable from just a literary analysis, like fourth grade literature level reading of this. And I think that the more interesting question is what's going on around the question itself and like around the answering of the question. And I think it's not that there's not an answer that I have an opinion about. It's not that I don't read this and have a feeling about how I interpret these words, but I'm going to quote Blythe here in this commentary on the case where he says...
It's your fourth time. You only get 5.
That's fair, honestly. Where he says...
That's canon.
Western commentators are divided in their interpretation of this. Some say Buddha knew the answer but would not give it for fear of being misunderstood. Others say he did not know the answer. Still others say that he did not know and did not care, since the problem had no connection with morality, with practical life, his sole concern. All these answers are correct. All answers are correct. All questions are correct. This is the Shakespearean, the Zen answer, which is neither correct nor not correct.
Let's forget all that, and I'm going to ask you different questions. Are there any matters that are not practical matters? I mean, if we say, like, suppose somebody says, like, one was her real body, one was not her real body, or her real self, rather. But we didn't talk about it earlier, but we talked about some synonyms for it. Totally picking and choosing, picking what's real and what's not real. This is me, this is not me. I posted once to a subreddit playing dumb, but intentionally, not like trying to be deceitful, very clearly with a shit-eating grin. Oh, so I heard that you can't bring anything through the gateless gate with you, but my friend said you had to bring everything with you. So which one is it? Right? So Zen is the sword that kills and gives life. So if you're like, oh, what I thought wasn't me is me, I think Buddhists leave it at that. The sword that kills. And they're like, oh, it's just nothing. If you take away the wheels and the spokes, I've never seen any of these cases have Zen masters say it. They always leave it as a question. So who are you? Where was I going with that? For our listeners, I ate some carrot cake earlier, and it's really messing with my head. So you got to watch out for carrot cake. Listen to the morals of the Peter Rabbit story. But no, so yeah, I think we get this picking and choosing when you choose what's real and what's not, as opposed to just realizing that all of it is real. And if you ask me, I'd say neither are her body.
Apparently, Kindle Fire has a text-to-speech that works pretty well.
Are you making Zen puns right now?
Oh, I'm not. So you can get a couple of good Zen texts on Kindle, and essentially they work pretty well as audiobooks.
Oh, nice. Hey, Amazon, yeah, if you want to pay us a sponsor, go for it. Hit me up, Bezos. Sorry you lost all that money in the divorce. But that's called Pathos for our listeners out there. Either Kindle Unlimited or Audible, one of the three, all three combined. If a Kindle has an audiobook, you get the audiobook.
Okay. Now, is that the Kindle app or is it just Kindle?
I have no idea because I haven't used it.
Is there a Kindle anymore? Is that even a thing?
I used to use my Kindle all the time because I realized I could torrent textbooks. Also, to the listeners out there, you get a Kindle Fire for like $50. You just torrent your textbooks that would otherwise cost you like $300 a semester. Throw those bad boys on there. This ain't illegal. I'm only saying do it for textbooks that are out of copyright. Do it for textbooks that are open source. That way you don't have to go pay for the paper.
And for the Zen text, it's a question because some of these things, the publishers are lax on the distribution and they're not putting it out anymore. So it's like, fuck them,
Yeah, well, for Blythe, it's such a pain. But I will say to the listeners out there, like, if you are interested in these cases and you are interested in, and then we haven't gotten to the sayings text, but there's a bazillion saying texts.
The saying texts are these koans, the people in them people wrote biographies basically in like recordings of things they supposedly said.
We only have about 4 books with the, cases with the Zen masters, but the saying texts are also great to have. It's a very Asian tradition. If any of you have read the Analects out there, that's pretty much everything that we get from Confucius in the Analect.
Is the New Testament just a Jesus sayings text?
No, because there's narrative applied. Like if you look at the sayings of Joshu, it's just like, a monk asked Joshu, what is the Sangha? Joshu said, a girl in pigtails, aka a virgin.
So they're just quoted exchanges, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
They're literally only quoted exchanges. Now, some of the books, as you get further in Chinese, the Tang, so as you get closer to the year 1000, the government gets more and more involved, and you start getting like biographies.
Also, I looked this up, movable type gets added in at the end of the...
Yeah, well, woodblock is going to really be exploding like right around this time. So,
Yep. I think it was like less than 150 years between that and Wanbu making the Blue Cliff record. So clearly Zen was not averse to...
I know.
And the listeners, yeah, we kind of like to end it on this like meta talk, because we've beat the case pretty hard, and we'll beat it more later. Don't you worry. I encourage you to beat it yourselves. But no, I will say, like, if you are interested in these, I think it's worth buying the books, because the more books people buy, and I'm not plugging this, like I'm not making any money off of this, and if I was, these books are like $12. But it seems trivial, but like I was a poor college kid I was in college for 8 years, not taking multiple degrees, 1 degree, 8 years.
Yeah, not a brag.
Not a brag. The goal was to show that there was a demand, so that we get more translators publishing, and there is legitimacy behind that. Ursap just published in 2018 a brand new Sayings of Young Men text, and that's one of the best sayings texts I've read. Ursap, he'll fill half the page with footnotes, which is a good thing, and he'll explain like, yeah, so it's this character, but I like took it this way, da da da. And if you haven't seen by now, these comparative translations are really, really useful in understanding these koans.
And there's so many comments in there, like, learn to translate, yes. But also, if you can contribute to someone else getting a translation out there, that's literally just as good for everyone. It's the same thing. It's just, you're just adding one person in either way.
I mean, imagine if we looked at this case without translators telling us what this story was, the backstory of this girl. We would be like, actually, we probably could get to the, what's
right.
When people think like, oh.
But what would I contribute to the conversation then? This whole conversation is just me reading Polite.
You've just slandered all of our listeners. Yeah, in the case of Blight's Mumonkan is one of the most amazing works I've read, Zen aside. And it's out of print, and you have to find it at like used bookstores and stuff like that. It's real hard to find. And that goes to show. But it also means it's not dead, it's not hopeless, because like I said, we have new books coming out.
It may be surprising to listeners, depending on where you're coming from, like this is Zen, like this is literally the inception of Zen, and your temples and shit, depending on what sort of school you're in, quote these things all the time. And if they don't quote them, then their lineage is literally claiming like the houses of Zen that you participate in now started. These are the people that started it 100%. There's no getting around that. But people don't translate them. People don't publish them, and people don't read them.
It's been 120 years since T.T. Suzuki.
Yeah.
And so, and I think it's really interesting. I see it as a subset of a larger thing that I would really call the Second Renaissance. Well, that I have explicitly called the Second Renaissance, a term I picked up shamelessly from Bon Iver. But we have all this Eastern stuff coming to the West. This is a big part of it.
I mean, I think the Platform Sutra was like, now don't quote me on this, but like the 50s, I think we got that. Maybe not.
Damn.
It might be with your 100-year estimate.
And that stuff starts as like 5 people in the United States who are like, in the religious studies programs of like a handful of universities are reading these, and like nobody else. And then it very slowly trickles down. And the example I like to give, there is a trickle down for sure in academia. And so you have the creation of quantum mechanics. And then after like a little under 100 years, you have Rick and Morty with an episode about the uncertainty principle, right? Yeah, I think we've exhausted this case of death. I say she wasn't either of them. I say dibs. Yeah, I say I already had dibs, right? Do you guys have any final comments you want to make?
I say she was the one who found her body.
What about you, Micah? Any final comments?
Final comments.
All right, word up.
You are the real person. Okay.
It's good to hear. All right. Well, I enjoyed this one. It was real small, but only interested once I see that sweet, sweet body of mine. This is Dan.
This is Brian, only interested in Dan's sweet, sweet body.
I'm interested in both bodies.
Oh, all right. Been good. All right, bye, listeners. Oh, yeah, by the way, if you liked this, like I said earlier, feel free to leave a rating. Don't leave a rating unless it's 5 stars, but leave a review on Apple or like French Toast, however you get your podcast. And if you have a case that you really want us to check out, hit us up, because Sangha. So yeah, feel free to leave a review and we'll know that you're out there. And yeah, so in the meantime, love you guys. Bye.